January 22nd, 1944. 0600 hours. Forward command post, 3 kilometers south of Monte Cassino, Italy. Major Thomas Brennan of the 36th Infantry Division sat in the cramped dugout, his hands trembling as he tallied the casualty reports from the previous 48 hours. 2,100 men. He read the number again, certain he had made an error in addition. The figure remained unchanged. 2 regiments, the 141st and 143rd, had attempted to cross the Rapido River. Fewer than half had returned. "This can't be real," Brennan whispered, his pencil falling from his fingers. "We had artillery. We had air support. We had everything." What Brennan didn't know, as he stared at those numbers in the dim lamplight of that dugout, was that he was witnessing the opening act of a 4-month demonstration that would shatter every assumption about modern warfare. The mathematics he was calculating would eventually reveal a truth so counterintuitive, so contrary to established military doctrine, that it would take decades for military historians to fully comprehend. Sometimes, overwhelming firepower doesn't win battles. Sometimes it loses them. The mathematics were staggering. By the time the battle for Monte Cassino concluded in mid-May 1944, Allied forces would suffer approximately 55,000 casualties. The Germans, defending with inferior numbers and no air support, would lose only 20,000, a casualty ratio of nearly 3-to-1 in favor of the defenders. But these numbers told only part of the story. Consider the firepower disparity. The Allies could call upon thousands of artillery pieces, complete air supremacy with hundreds of bombers and fighter bombers, and virtually unlimited ammunition. The Germans possessed perhaps 1/5 the artillery, no air cover whatsoever, and chronic ammunition shortages. By every conventional military calculation, the defenders should have been obliterated in days. Instead, they held for 18 weeks. The transformation in military thinking this battle represented was absolute. Before Cassino, Allied doctrine held that sufficient artillery and aerial bombardment could neutralize any defensive position. After Cassino, that certainty lay in ruins alongside the monastery that crowned the mountain. The battle had begun with confidence that bordered on certainty. In mid-January 1944, Allied forces reached the western terminus of the German Gustav Line, a defensive network that stretched across the Italian peninsula. The line followed the natural barriers created by the Rapido, Liri, and Garigliano rivers, with the ancient Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino dominating the valleys from its mountaintop perch. Major Brennan, 32 years old, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, had graduated from West Point in the class of 1933. He had studied the campaigns of Grant and Sherman, Pershing and Foch. His training emphasized firepower, industrial capacity, and the inevitability of material superiority translating to battlefield success. Every staff college lecture, every tactical manual, every lesson from the Great War had taught him the same principle. Bring enough guns, drop enough bombs, and the enemy breaks. The initial assault plans reflected this confidence. British X-Corps would attack along the coast, securing the junction of the Garigliano and Liri rivers. The American 36th Division would force the Rapido River crossing near Cassino town itself. French colonial troops would advance through the mountains to the north. With multiple breakthroughs, the Germans would be forced to abandon the entire line. "We'll be in Rome by March," Brennan remembered his commanding officer saying in the planning sessions. "The Germans can't possibly hold once we commit our full weight." The German defenders thought otherwise, but their opinions weren't considered particularly relevant by Allied planners who knew, absolutely knew, what massed firepower could accomplish. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came not from the casualty reports, though those were horrific enough. It came from Second Lieutenant James Morrison, 28 years old, from Austin, Texas, who had survived the initial Rapido crossing attempt. Brennan found him in a field hospital on January 23rd, his left arm bandaged, his eyes carrying something worse than physical wounds. "Tell me what happened," Brennan said, pulling up a camp stool beside Morrison's cot. Morrison stared at the tent ceiling for a long moment before speaking. "We had everything, Major. Everything. Our artillery pounded their positions for 3 hours before we started across. 3 hours of continuous shelling. We could see the explosions from our assembly positions, could feel them in our chests. Trees were getting blown apart, buildings collapsing. We absolutely thought, nothing could survive that." "And?" Brennan prompted gently. "And we got to the river around 2100 hours. The boats were supposed to be there. Some were, some weren't. The engineers had taken casualties getting them forward. We launched what we had. The current was stronger than reconnaissance reported, swept some boats downstream. But we made it across, maybe 150 men from my company initially." Morrison's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "That's when the shooting started. Machine guns, Major. Dozens of them. And mortars, perfectly ranged. Like they'd been waiting there untouched, like our artillery hadn't fired a single shell. The boats coming behind us, they just disintegrated. Men in the water screaming. The muzzle flashes from the German positions, they seemed to be everywhere." "The artillery didn't suppress them?" Brennan asked, though he already knew the answer. "Sir, I don't think it touched them. We found their bunkers, later, the ones we managed to reach. Logs and earth, 6 feet thick in some places. Our shells had hit. We could see the craters, but the bunkers were intact. And they had interlocking fields of fire covering every approach. They weren't just defending. They were executing a plan." Brennan recorded Morrison's account in his notebook, his hand cramping from gripping the pencil too tightly. "If our firepower didn't suppress them," he asked, "then what advantage did it give us?" Morrison laughed, a sound without humor. "Advantage? Major, I think it warned them we were coming." The second revelation came from captured German documents. On January 25th, a patrol from the 34th Infantry Division overran a forward command post near Point 445. Among the papers recovered was a defensive planning document from the German 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, dated January 10th. Captain Robert Schaefer, intelligence officer, brought the translated document to Brennan's attention. Schaefer, 36 years old, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had taught German literature at Northwestern University before the war. He spread the document on Brennan's field desk, with the care of a scholar handling a rare manuscript. "You need to read this, Tom," Schaefer said quietly. The document detailed German defensive preparations with meticulous precision. It described bunker construction techniques, overhead logs arranged in crisscross patterns, earth packed 6 to 8 feet deep, interlocking fire lanes calculated to cover every potential crossing point. It specified ammunition allocation, machine gun crews rationed to short, disciplined bursts rather than sustained fire, conserving rounds while maximizing casualties. It outlined communication procedures between strong points, ensuring mutual support. But what stopped Brennan's breath was a single paragraph in the tactical guidance section. Allied reliance on preparatory bombardment provides advance warning of assault timing and location. Heavy shelling indicates main effort. Troops should shelter in deep bunkers during bombardment. then immediately man fighting positions when artillery lifts. The predictability of American and British tactics is our greatest defensive advantage. They know, Brennan said. They know exactly what we're going to do. Schaefer nodded grimly. It gets worse. Look at the ammunition conservation notes. Brennan read the section Schaefer indicated. German units were instructed to hold fire until targets reached predetermined range markers, typically between 50 and 150 meters. Machine guns were to fire in brief bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, then shift to alternate targets. Mortar crews were allocated only 60 rounds per day, to be used only against concentrated targets or crossing attempts. They're rationing ammunition because they have no choice, Brennan said. But it's making them more effective, not less. Every round counts. Every burst is aimed. Now look at our ammunition expenditure reports, Schaefer said, pulling out another document. The contrast was obscene. American artillery units fired thousands of rounds daily, often in preparatory barrages or on suspected enemy positions. Infantry units expended ammunition freely, particularly in night engagements where visibility limited aimed fire. The ratio of ammunition expended to casualties inflicted was approximately 40,000 to 1. We're throwing away our advantage, Brennan realized. All our industrial capacity, all our supply chains, and we're using it to warn them we're coming and to waste ammunition on empty positions. There's more, Schaefer said. The document mentions that German officers have started requesting that their positions be bombed. Brennan looked up sharply. What? It's in the marginalia, a handwritten note. Apparently, after Allied bombing attacks, the rubble created better defensive positions than intact buildings. Cellars that survived became nearly impenetrable bunkers. Collapsed buildings created obstacles that channeled attackers into predetermined killing zones. They've realized that our bombs are helping them. Brennan felt a cold sensation spreading through his chest. That's impossible. Bombing destroys defensive positions. It's doctrine. It's proven. It was proven, Schaefer corrected, before concrete and modern engineering. These aren't wooden fortifications from the last war, Tom. These are layered defenses designed specifically to survive artillery and aerial bombardment. And when the bombing doesn't destroy them completely, it improves them. The pattern became undeniable through February. The 34th Infantry Division, reinforced with French Moroccan troops, managed to establish a foothold across the Rapido River north of Cassino on January 24th. For a week, they fought through terrain so mountainous that tanks couldn't operate, reducing the battle to infantry against infantry. Sergeant William Chen, 26 years old, from San Francisco, California, kept a diary throughout the fighting. Brennan obtained a copy after Chen was evacuated with severe frostbite in mid-February. The entries painted a picture of combat that contradicted everything Brennan thought he understood about modern warfare. February 1st entry: captured a German position today on the forward slope. 3 men defending it, 2 wounded, 1 dead from our initial assault. Found approximately 200 rounds of ammunition remaining, 3 potato masher grenades, and half a loaf of bread. The position had withstood at least 6 direct hits from our 105 artillery, judging by the craters. The bunker roof was partially collapsed, but the firing position was still functional. The 2 wounded Germans were 16 and 17 years old. They fought like seasoned veterans. When we asked through our interpreter why they hadn't withdrawn when surrounded, they said they hadn't received orders to do so. They had simply stayed and fought with what they had. February 4th entry: we're being counterattacked constantly. Small groups, never more than a squad, but they know this terrain perfectly. They appear out of nowhere, hit our exposed positions, then fade back into the rocks. We fire hundreds of rounds at shadows. They fire dozens of rounds at targets they can see. Our casualties are mounting. I've lost 9 men from my squad in 4 days. German documents we captured show they've lost 3 men from the platoon opposing us in the same period. February 7th entry. Reached point 445 today, the highest ground we've taken. From here we can see the monastery, maybe 2 kilometers away. It looks untouched by the war, white walls gleaming in the sun. Intelligence says Germans aren't using it, that Field Marshal Kesselring ordered it kept empty for cultural preservation reasons. But the positions below it are strong. We can't advance further without taking that hill. Command is arguing about what to do. February 10th entry. Heavy snow last night. Germans are better equipped for winter fighting than we are. They have proper cold weather gear. We're making do with what we have. More men are casualties from frostbite than from combat today. The war has become about endurance. Who can tolerate this cold, this altitude, this grinding misery longer? I think they can. They're defending. We're attacking uphill through snow. The mathematics favor them. That last line haunted Brennan. The mathematics favor them. How had that happened? How had America's enormous material advantages translated into mathematical disadvantages at the point of contact? The third revelation came on February 15th, 1944, when Allied command decided to resolve the deadlock by destroying the monastery itself. The decision was controversial. Aerial reconnaissance had provided no definitive evidence of German military use of the ancient structure. But the hilltop it occupied dominated the battlefield, and Allied commanders convinced themselves that even if Germans weren't currently using it, they inevitably would. Brennan watched from an observation post as 229 heavy and medium bombers approached the mountain. It was 9:30 in the morning. The monastery sat atop Monte Cassino like a crown, its white walls luminous against the gray winter sky. B-17, Flying Fortresses and B-25 Mitchells, along with B-26 Marauders, arrived in waves. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, 41 years old, from Boston, Massachusetts, stood beside Brennan at the observation post. Webb commanded an artillery battalion that had been shelling German positions for weeks. He had requested the bombing, convinced it would break the German defense. "Watch this, Tom," Webb said with satisfaction. "Nothing survives this. Nothing." The first bombs fell at 9:28. Even from 5 kilometers away, the explosions were tremendous. Massive plumes of smoke and dust erupted from the mountaintop. Wave after wave of bombers released their loads. 1,150 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs fell in approximately 3.5 hours. The monastery, built in the 6th century and rebuilt over 14 centuries, effectively ceased to exist as an intact structure. Artillery joined the bombardment. Webb's guns, along with dozens of other batteries, poured shells into the rubble. The top of Monte Cassino disappeared behind a cloud of smoke and dust that rose thousands of feet into the air. Nobody could survive that, Webb said. Nobody. But someone had survived. At approximately 1400 hours, as the dust began to clear, scouts reported movement in the ruins. German troops, far from being destroyed, were moving into the rubble. They had sheltered in the valley during the bombing, then immediately occupied the demolished monastery. Captain Richard Foster, 29 years old, from Seattle, Washington, led a reconnaissance patrol that reached within 300 meters of the monastery ruins on February 16th. His report, delivered verbally to Brennan that evening, contained a detail that should have been impossible. "They're building positions in the rubble. Foster said, his voice carrying disbelief. Not repairing. Building. The bombing created thousands of concrete fragments, chunks of wall, sections of foundation. They're using them like building blocks. The cellars that survived, they're nearly indestructible now. Covered by tons of rubble, but with firing ports they've cleared. And the whole mountaintop, it's like a moonscape. No clear approach routes anymore. Just craters and debris fields that funnel attackers into narrow lanes. They have machine guns covering every approach. The bombing helped them? Brennan asked, though he already knew the answer. Sir, the bombing created the perfect defensive position. Before, it was just a building. Now it's a fortress. And we can't bomb it again because it's already destroyed. Artillery doesn't do anything. It just moves rubble around. We'd have to take it with infantry, straight up the mountain, through multiple defensive lines, against troops in positions we created for them. Webb, who had joined the conversation, looked stricken. That's not possible. We dropped over 1,000 tons of ordnance. We pulverized that structure. Colonel, Foster said gently, we pulverized it into the perfect defensive position. Every chunk of that ancient concrete is now a bunker wall. Every collapsed cellar is now a shelter. And the German 1st Parachute Division is moving in tonight. They're grateful for the upgrade. The psychological impact of this realization rippled through Allied command over the following days. Brennan watched senior officers grapple with a truth that contradicted their entire understanding of modern warfare. In staff meetings, in official reports, in private conversations, he heard the same patterns of denial and rationalization. We just need more bombs, some argued. Bigger bombs. We need to adjust our tactics, others insisted. Better coordination between air and ground forces. But Brennan had begun to understand something more fundamental. The doctrine itself was flawed. The assumption that firepower superiority automatically translated to battlefield advantage was wrong, at least in this terrain, against this type of defense, employed by this caliber of troops. He found himself unable to sleep, lying awake in his dugout, calculating and recalculating. The 36th Division's casualties at the Rapido Crossing, 2,100 men in 48 hours. The overall casualty rate for Allied forces attempting to cross the rivers and take the heights, approximately 300 to 400 per day, every day, for weeks. The German casualty rate, estimated from captured documents and prisoner interrogations, approximately 100 to 150 per day. The mathematics kept returning to the same conclusion. The side with less firepower, less supply, less mobility, and less air support was inflicting casualties at a rate nearly 3 times higher than they were suffering. How was that possible? The answer began to emerge through accumulated observations from the fighting through February and March. Brennan compiled reports from dozens of unit commanders, patrol leaders, and individual soldiers. The pattern was consistent and damning. First Lieutenant David Martinez, 24 years old, from El Paso, Texas, commanded a rifle company in the 34th Division. His company had fought continuously since late January, rotating between front-line positions and reserve positions every few days. By early March, his original roster of 184 men was down to 67 effectives. The problem isn't their numbers, Martinez explained to Brennan during a rest period. We usually outnumber them at the point of contact. The problem is that they're always in better positions. Always. We attack uphill through open ground. They defend from prepared positions with overhead cover. We advance through terrain where any move might trigger a mine or a mortar barrage. They sit in bunkers and wait for us to expose ourselves. But our artillery, Brennan protested, our air support, That's supposed to neutralize their positions. Martinez shook his head. Major, have you been forward? Have you seen what their positions actually look like? Brennan admitted he hadn't. His duties kept him at headquarters, analyzing reports rather than observing firsthand. Come with me, Martinez said. I'll show you what we're fighting. They reached the forward positions an hour later. Martinez led Brennan to a captured German bunker on the lower slopes of Monte Cassino. The structure had been built into a hillside, with only a narrow firing slit visible from the front. Martinez gestured for Brennan to examine the construction. The bunker was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. Logs approximately 30 centimeters thick formed the roof, laid in multiple layers. Above the logs, packed earth extended approximately 2 meters thick. The walls were reinforced with sandbags and rubble. The firing position was carefully angled to cover a specific approach route while remaining protected from flanking fire. How many artillery hits would it take to destroy this? Martinez asked. Brennan studied the structure. Direct hit from a heavy shell might do it, maybe, or sustained fire from multiple guns. We've fired thousands of shells at positions like this, Martinez said. And you know what we've discovered? Unless the shell lands directly on the bunker, within maybe 2 meters, it doesn't do much damage. The earth absorbs the blast. The overhead cover deflects shrapnel, and these positions are small, hard to target precisely. So we fire thousands of rounds and kill a few Germans and suppress them temporarily. Then we advance, and they emerge from their shelters and kill dozens of us. He led Brennan further forward, to a point where they could observe the monastery ruins through binoculars. Now look up there. Every pile of rubble, every collapsed wall, every crater. Germans have turned them into fighting positions. The bombing didn't destroy their defenses. It created them. And we can't bomb rubble. We can't destroy something that's already destroyed. Brennan felt the truth settling into his bones, like the cold of the mountain altitude. We've made things worse, he said quietly. Significantly worse, Martinez confirmed. Before the bombing, the monastery was just a building on a hill. Now it's an almost indestructible fortress, and we have to take it with infantry because nothing else will work. The human cost of this revelation became unavoidable during the third major assault in mid-March 1944. New Zealand and Indian divisions led the attack, supported by 3 hours of preparatory bombardment. Brennan observed from a command post, tracking unit reports as they came in. The bombardment began at 8:30 in the morning on March 15th. Over 400 artillery pieces and 200 bombers participated. The weight of explosive dropped on the casino area in those 3 hours exceeded anything previously concentrated on such a small area in the Italian campaign. Then, the troops advanced. Within hours, the pattern that had become grimly familiar repeated itself. Initial progress, followed by devastating resistance from German positions that should have been neutralized, but weren't. By nightfall, Allied forces had gained several hundred meters at the cost of hundreds of casualties. The German line bent, but didn't break. Private First Class Robert Williams, 19 years old from Detroit, Michigan, survived the March 15th assault as part of a New Zealand infantry battalion. Brennan interviewed him on March 17th after Williams was evacuated with wounds to both legs. "They knew we were coming, sir," Williams said, his voice tight with pain and frustration. "Soon as our artillery stopped, their machine guns opened up, like they'd been waiting. I saw guys, my friends, just cut down in the first 50 meters. We tried to use shell craters for cover, but the craters just showed them where to aim. Every meter forward, we lost people." Did you reach the German positions? Brennan asked. Some of us did. My section got into the edge of Casino Town, into some buildings. Found a German position in a cellar. 3 men, 1 machine gun, maybe 200 rounds left. They'd held off our entire company for 2 hours. 3 men. And when we finally cleared them out, we found they were positioned so they could cover multiple approach routes. Had pre-planned firing positions marked with chalk. Ranges calculated. They didn't waste ammunition. Every burst was aimed. Williams paused, struggling with morphine and emotion. We're brave enough, sir. We're not cowards. But it's like fighting mathematics. They're in positions where they can kill 10 of us for every one we kill of them. And we keep attacking anyway because those are our orders. But the numbers, sir, the numbers don't favor us. That phrase again. The numbers don't favor us. How had American industrial might, American firepower, American determination produced a mathematical reality where the numbers didn't favor them? By late March, Brennan had compiled enough data to construct a complete picture of the Battle of Monte Cassino's terrible arithmetic. He prepared a report for Division Command, knowing it would be received poorly, but unable to stay silent. The report documented the following. Allied artillery expenditure. Approximately 400,000 to 500,000 shells fired at German positions around Cassino from mid-January through late March. Estimated German casualties from artillery, 2,000 to 3,000. Cost per casualty, 150 to 250 shells. Allied aerial bombardment. Approximately 4,000 tons of bombs dropped on Cassino area over the same period. Estimated German casualties from bombing, 500 to 800. Cost per casualty, 5 to 8 tons of explosives. German ammunition expenditure, estimated at less than 10,000 artillery or mortar rounds, less than 1 million small arms rounds over the same period. Estimated Allied casualties inflicted, 15,000 to 20,000. Cost per casualty, approximately 1 artillery round per 15 casualties, or approximately 50 small arms rounds per casualty. The efficiency ratios were inverted. The side with less ammunition was achieving better results per round expended. The side with air supremacy was causing fewer casualties per bomb than the side with no air support was causing with small arms fire. But the most damning data came from analyzing specific engagements. Brennan selected 12 separate company-level attacks where detailed records existed. In each case, the attacking Allied force outnumbered the defending German force by at least 3 to 1. In each case, the attackers had artillery and air support available. In each case, the attackers suffered higher casualties than the defenders. The pattern was consistent. Prepared defensive positions in mountainous terrain, manned by well-trained infantry with limited but carefully rationed ammunition, could defeat numerically superior attacking forces with massive fire support. The defenders' advantages, terrain and preparation, outweighed the attackers' advantages, numbers, and firepower. The report concluded with a question that Brennan knew was dangerously close to defeatism. Given current tactical approaches, is it mathematically possible to take Monte Cassino at an acceptable casualty rate? Colonel Webb, who received the report first, didn't answer the question directly. He merely said, "This doesn't leave my desk, Tom. This is the kind of analysis that ends careers and damages morale. The answer isn't to stop attacking. The answer is to attack better." But Brennan had stopped believing that attacking better would solve a problem that seemed fundamental to the nature of the battlefield itself. The fourth and final offensive, Operation Diadem, launched in the night of May 11th to 12th, 1944. Allied command had reorganized forces, brought in fresh divisions, and refined tactics based on months of hard-learned lessons. The scale was unprecedented. Multiple corps attacking simultaneously across a broad front, with Polish forces assigned to finally take the monastery itself. Brennan watched the artillery preparation begin at 2300 hours on May 11th. Over 2,000 guns participated. A rolling barrage that marched across the German defensive lines like mechanical thunder. The sound was physically painful, a continuous pressure wave that made thought difficult. But this time, the ground assault followed immediately behind the barrage, giving German defenders minimal time to emerge from their shelters and man fighting positions. French colonial forces achieved a breakthrough in the southern mountains. British and American forces pressed forward in the valleys. The German line, stretched thin after months of attrition, began to crack. For 3 days, the battle hung in balance. Then, on May 13th, French troops captured Montemayo, turning the southern flank of the Gustav Line. The German position became untenable. The defensive line that had held for 4 months began to collapse, not from the weight of bombs or shells, but from maneuver and the accumulated exhaustion of defending against relentless attacks. On May 17th, Polish forces launched what would be the final assault on Monte Cassino Monastery itself. German 1st Parachute Division, reduced from months of combat to a fraction of its original strength, fought with characteristic skill and determination. But numbers, at last, told. The Poles surrounded the position, cutting off withdrawal routes. On the morning of May 18th, Polish troops entered the monastery ruins. The Germans had evacuated during the night, leaving behind only 30 seriously wounded men who couldn't be moved. The Polish flag rose over the shattered walls at 10:20 in the morning. The battle was over. Monte Cassino had fallen. The road to Rome lay open, and the cost of that victory lay scattered across the slopes of that mountain and the valleys below. Captain Schaefer found Brennan on May 20th, sitting in the same dugout where he'd tallied the first casualty figures 4 months earlier. Schaefer carried a folder of documents, recently captured from German headquarters as they retreated. "You need to see these," Schaefer said. The documents were German casualty reports and after-action assessments from the battle. As Schaefer translated, Brennan felt a sick fascination. The Germans had been tracking the same statistics he had, arriving at similar conclusions. Total German casualties, January through May, approximately 20,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Total Allied casualties, same period, approximately 55,000. The ratio Brennan had calculated from fragmented evidence was confirmed by German records, nearly 3-to-1. But more illuminating were the tactical assessments. German commanders had documented their defensive philosophy with clarity. Allow the Allies to expend their firepower advantage on prepared positions designed to survive bombardment. Conserve ammunition. Force the attackers to advance through killing zones where defenders' positional advantages outweighed attackers' numerical advantages. Accept higher casualty rates when necessary, but only when trading each German casualty for 2 or 3 Allied casualties. One document, a report from Lieutenant General Richard Heydrich, commander of the German 1st Parachute Division, included a passage that Brennan had Schaefer translate 3 times to ensure accuracy. The Allied reliance on firepower superiority has become a vulnerability. They bomb and shell for hours, alerting us to their intentions and allowing us time to shelter. Then they advance through terrain we have prepared over months, against positions we have sighted precisely to maximize our effectiveness and minimize theirs. Their artillery destroys buildings and creates rubble, which we immediately turn into fortifications superior to the original structures. Their bombing of the monastery handed us the best defensive position of the entire battle. The Allies' greatest strength, their industrial capacity and firepower, has become our greatest ally. Brennan set down the translated document, his hands shaking slightly. "We've been doing their work for them," he said quietly. "Every bomb we dropped, every shell we fired, we were improving their positions." "Not always," Schaefer corrected. "The final offensive worked because we changed tactics, shorter bombardments, immediate assaults, maneuver instead of just firepower. But it took 4 months and 55,000 casualties to learn that lesson." "A lesson," Brennan said, "that contradicts everything we teach at staff colleges, everything we built our doctrine on." "Maybe," Schaefer suggested, "the doctrine works differently depending on terrain and circumstances. Open plains, mobile warfare, firepower advantage might be decisive. Mountains, prepared defenses, skilled defenders. Maybe the mathematics change." Brennan pulled out his casualty notebooks, 4 months of data compiled in cramped handwriting. "Do you know what haunts me? It's not just that we lost 55,000 men taking this position. It's that we probably could have bypassed it entirely. The Anzio landing was supposed to draw German forces away from the Gustav Line. If we'd been patient, if we'd built up forces for a broader offensive from the start, we might have turned this entire position without battering ourselves against it for 4 months. But we didn't know that in January," Schaefer pointed out. "No," Brennan agreed. "We didn't know. We thought firepower would solve the problem. We thought modern industrial warfare made defensive positions obsolete. We thought overwhelming material superiority guaranteed victory." He gestured at the document spread before him. "We were wrong about everything." The Allied advance continued northward. German forces fell back to successive defensive lines, the Hitler Line, the Caesar Line, each abandoned more quickly than the last as German reserves were exhausted. Rome fell on June 4th, 1944. The Italian campaign ground on, but the nature of the fighting gradually changed as German defensive strength declined. Brennan remained in Italy through the summer, analyzing the lessons of Monte Cassino for staff reports and training documents. The writing came hard. How did one explain that America's greatest advantages had, in specific circumstances, become disadvantages? How did one reconcile the contradiction that overwhelming firepower could alert, prepare, and even assist a determined defender? He interviewed more survivors, compiled more statistics, traced the battle's contours with increasing precision. The picture that emerged was consistent. Monte Cassino had been a unique battlefield where terrain, defensive preparation, and attacker overconfidence combined to reverse the usual mathematics of modern war. On August 15, 1944, Brennan was reassigned to a planning staff in preparation for operations in France. Before leaving Italy, he made a pilgrimage to Monte Cassino itself, now far behind the front lines. The monastery ruins still dominated the mountain, shattered walls rising from heaps of rubble. Polish forces had established a temporary cemetery near the site for their dead. Brennan walked through the graves, reading names, ages, units. So many were 20 or younger. So many had died in the final week of fighting, just before the Germans withdrew. He climbed to the monastery ruins themselves, carefully navigating the rubble. The view from the hilltop was extraordinary. He could see down into all the valleys, could trace the river lines where his division had tried to cross 4 months earlier. From this height, the killing zones were obvious. Every approach route was visible. Any movement below would have been immediately apparent to observers here. Standing in the ruins, Brennan finally understood with visceral certainty what the battle had demonstrated. Position preparation, and skill could offset enormous material disadvantages. The Germans had occupied the high ground, prepared it meticulously, and defended it with tactical excellence. Allied firepower had been largely wasted because it targeted positions designed specifically to survive it. A Polish officer, a major like himself, approached across the rubble. They exchanged salutes. "American?" the Polish officer asked. "Yes, 36th Division. We were here in January and February." The Polish major nodded. "2nd Corps. We were here in May. This place, it drank blood. German blood, Polish blood, British blood, American blood. All the same once it soaks into this mountain." "Was it worth it?" Brennan asked, surprising himself with the question. The Polish major considered, gazing out over the valleys below. "Worth is the wrong word. Necessary, perhaps. The Germans had to be defeated. This position had to be taken. But the cost, the way it was done, perhaps that could have been different." He paused. "I read some German documents we captured. They were afraid we would bypass this position, attack elsewhere. They were relieved when we kept attacking here, where they were strongest. That tells you something, yes?" It told Brennan everything. In 1994, 50 years after the battle, Brennan returned to Monte Cassino one final time. He was 82 years old, using a cane, accompanied by his grandson, who was writing a college thesis on World War II Italian campaign. The monastery had been rebuilt, faithful to its original design. White walls gleamed in the sunshine, exactly as they had before the bombing. The Polish cemetery was permanent now, well-maintained, with eternal flames burning for the fallen. Multiple national cemeteries dotted the landscape: British, American, German, French, Indian, all within a few kilometers of each other. They visited the monastery museum, where artifacts from the battle were preserved behind glass. Shell fragments, weapons, personal items recovered from the rubble. A display on the bombing included photographs of the destroyed monastery, looking like a lunar landscape. A tour group was listening to a guide explain the battle. Brennan and his grandson joined them. The bombing of February 15, 1944, was one of the most controversial decisions of the war. The guide was saying, 229 bombers dropped 1,150 tons of ordnance, destroying a structure that had stood for nearly 1,400 years. The intention was to eliminate a German observation post. But no conclusive evidence existed that Germans were using the monastery militarily at the time. A tourist asked, "Did the bombing help the Allies?" The guide shook his head. Actually, it helped the Germans. The rubble created better defensive positions than the intact building had provided. German paratroopers immediately occupied the ruins and used them as a fortress for the next 3 months. Military historians generally agree the bombing was, from a tactical standpoint, counterproductive. So it was a mistake? Another tourist asked. A mistake based on assumptions, the guide replied. Commanders assumed that bombing would weaken the defense. They assumed that overwhelming firepower would neutralize prepared positions. They assumed that modern warfare had made mountain defenses obsolete. The Battle of Monte Cassino proved all these assumptions wrong at tremendous cost. Brennan's grandson noticed his grandfather's reaction. "Are you okay?" "I was here," Brennan said quietly. "I watched them drop those bombs. I thought it would end the battle. I thought nothing could survive that much explosive." The guide overheard. "You were here during the battle, sir?" 36th Infantry Division, January through May, 44. The tour group turned, suddenly attentive. The guide approached. Could you share any memories?" Brennan hesitated, then nodded slowly. The thing I remember most isn't the combat, though that was terrible enough. It's the moment of realization. I was an intelligence officer, analyzing casualty figures and tactical reports. And I realized, maybe in February or early March, that we were doing it wrong. That our firepower advantage was actually working against us in that specific terrain, against that specific enemy. That we were bombing and shelling them into better positions, not worse ones. He paused, organizing thoughts half a century old. Everyone talks about how the Germans were outnumbered and outgunned, but held for 4 months. That's true. But what nobody quite understood at the time was why. It wasn't just courage, though they were brave. It wasn't just skill, though they were skilled. It was that the nature of the battlefield, the mountains and the rivers and the prepared defenses, inverted the normal advantages. Our firepower became a liability because it telegraphed our intentions and improved at their positions. Our numerical superiority became a liability because we had to attack uphill through killing zones. Everything we thought would win the battle actually prolonged it. And the lesson? The guide asked gently. The lesson, Brennan said, is that war isn't mathematics. Or rather, it is. But the equation changes based on terrain, circumstances, the quality of the troops, the nature of the defenses. What works in one place fails in another. Overwhelming force can win, but it can also alert, prepare, and even assist your enemy. Everything depends on context. His grandson helped him to a bench overlooking the valley. Brennan sat, breathing heavily, the altitude still affecting him even after all these years. I think about the men, he said to his grandson. 55,000 Allied casualties, 20,000 German, 75,000 total. All to take one mountain and the valleys around it. And we learned eventually. The final offensive in May worked because we'd learned. Shorter bombardments, immediate assaults, maneuver. But it took 4 months to learn. 4 months and 55,000 casualties. Was there another way? His grandson asked. Brennan watched the tourists wandering through the cemetery, reading gravestones, taking photographs of the rebuilt monastery. Maybe, probably, bypassing the position entirely, building up overwhelming force for a broad offensive that would have made this position untenable without direct assault. Being patient. But we weren't patient. We thought firepower would solve everything. We thought modern industrial war had made defensive positions obsolete. He stood slowly, leaning on his cane. The bombing on February 15th, which I watched from 5 kilometers away, which I thought would end the battle, actually extended it by 3 months. That's what I think about, 50 years later. How certainty can be wrong. How overwhelming advantage can become disadvantage. How the strongest weapon can sometimes be patience and the right question. What question? His grandson asked. Why are we attacking here, where they're strongest, instead of somewhere they're weak? Brennan smiled sadly. It took us 4 months and 55,000 casualties to finally ask that question. And by then, we'd lost more men taking one mountain than the Germans lost defending it. The mathematics were against us from the start. We just didn't realize it until the sums were written in blood on these slopes. They walked back down the mountain together, the old man and the young, past the cemeteries where the mathematics of 1944 lay sleeping beneath white crosses and visiting flowers. Above them, the monastery stood white and whole again, its walls rebuilt, its history preserved, the rubble of that terrible battle long since cleared away and buried. But buried doesn't mean forgotten. And the lesson of Monte Cassino, written in a casualty ratio of nearly 3-1 against the attackers, remains. Sometimes overwhelming force overwhelms the wrong thing. Sometimes the advantage lies not with the side that can drop the most bombs, but with the side that understands the battlefield well enough to make those bombs irrelevant. Sometimes victory goes not to the strongest, but to those best positioned, best prepared, and fighting on ground that inverts the equation. The Allies learned that lesson eventually. The cost of the education was 55,000 casualties and 4 months of bitter fighting for a position that, in retrospect, might not have needed to be taken at all. The diploma was the ruins of a monastery bombed into a fortress, rebuilt now but forever marked by the terrible mathematics of 1944.